Hello, welcome to AT&T ThreatTraq for April 16th, 2013. This program provides network security highlights, discussion, and countermeasures for cyber threats. I'm joined today by Jim Clausing, Stan Nerlov, and John Hogeboom. And thanks for joining, guys. I'm Brian Rixrode, and we'll go ahead and start the program here. There is a lot of, basically, I guess I'll call it hoopla for lack of a better term here, but activity going on, concern about attacks against WordPress. And John, what can you tell us about this?
Yeah, thanks, Brian. So there is a bunch of buzz around this story. It kind of kicked up, I want to say maybe last Friday or so. And the basic gist of it is that a lot of security researchers and other ISPs and whatnot have been observing that there's a lot of brute force scanning going on against WordPress sites, notably the admin interface on WordPress sites. So basically, there's some set of bots out there, and what they actually, they're pretty sure these bots engaged in the brute force attacks right now are desktop machines, so they're not other web servers, but they're desktop machines trying to brute force into the admin interface on WordPress using a list of about 1,000 different usernames and passwords. If they get in, what they're doing is they're dropping a PHP script on there, which is pretty standard practice in cases like these. And that allows them to do other things, such as upload additional files or, drop scripts that could be used for other malicious activities. So one of the things about this is there is some similarity to the Brobot actors who have been engaged in the financial DDoS attacks. That being said, there's no definitive connection between the two. So there is some similarity in the tactics being used, but no confirmation that they're anyway related whatsoever. And one thing I did want to point out in the next slide here is that some of the recommendations, so obviously they're not really targeting an exploit on WordPress like some of the other cases that we've seen in the past. They're really brute forcing, trying to password guess their way into the admin interface. So WordPress actually has a pretty decent article on how to harden your WordPress site. So out of the box, if you install it, it's probably not the most secure setup, and they have a lot of recommendations on how you can make it more secure. And if you follow this, you probably have a lot more likelihood of keeping your WordPress installation from getting compromised. So some recommendations: upgrade your WordPress site if you haven't already. Not that that's a factor here, but it's always good to have your software up to date so old vulnerabilities aren't exposed. And make sure your admin password's updated to be very complex. And there's some other things you could do to restrict access to the admin interface in general, so that just not anybody can wander into it. And I think that was the basic gist of that story. So I guess we'll see how it unfolds. We're watching this one pretty closely because of any potential interaction of turning these bots into attackers in some other sense, similar to the Brobot attacker bots that are web servers that are used to engage in attacks. So, we're keeping an eye on it.
You know, John, this reminds me of another type of similar technique we talked about a few weeks ago, which used Tomcat Apache web administration root forcing as well. So it's a very similar technique, it sounds like. Definitely want to keep those passwords strong and secure. Right.
And, so this is just one of many software packages out there. Tomcat is another, and, we had mentioned some actors going after Tomcat, WordPress. We know that the Brobot guys go after Joomla, or they have historically in the past gone after Joomla, which is similar to WordPress. And I'm sure there's others that aren't even coming to mind, but, pretty much every software package has some vulnerability out there, and or they have some kind of administrative interface that people will try to get access to. And when we look at the scanning stuff in the Internet Weather Report, we always see VNC and Remote Desktop Protocol and SSH. Those are all kinds of brute force attacks as well against those types of services, but these are web-based services that attackers are trying to compromise that web server and use it for their own purposes.
So John, in some of the counts here, it sounded like they have theorized that this may have already compromised up right around 90,000 web servers. Do we have anything to substantiate that, or?
I don't have any substantiating counts of that myself. We are monitoring this one, but it really just went into our kind of tracking to kind of get counts and stuff like that as of last night. So I don't really have numbers yet in terms of how many machines we're actually seeing participating in this bot yet.
Okay.
But that is what the reports are saying, is around 90,000 or so from third-party sources in the media.
Yeah, based on some of the descriptions that I've heard, I haven't seen a lot of, obviously the password guessing strategy and, going after web servers, this does look a little bit like the bro bots, but I haven't seen much else that suggests that it's, really has very strong similarities. There are a lot of other things, and as you said, the dropping of PHP scripts is fairly typical in scenarios like this. So I'm a little skeptical about that sort of claim at this point, although, it is certainly the type of thing that we need to be paying attention to, is what relationships might exist with other activities that we're concerned about. So absolutely we should keep an eye on this. Thank you, John.
All right.
So I think next here what we're going to talk about, one of the weaknesses in this particular case that John was describing is this password guessing activities. And I think they claimed, I'm not sure if John mentioned it, but on the order of about 1,000 different passwords, username and password combinations that they're trying against this. And, one of the things that I happened to run across an article recently that was published by Bill Cheswick. Bill Cheswick is basically, I'll use the term legend in the computer security world. He was one of the co-authors of the firewalls book that's been basically considered the reference in terms of firewalls and the origin of firewalls. And so he's still involved in the security community, and he published a paper with ACM on rethinking passwords. I want to just share a few thoughts with you about this. There are a number of things he pointed out, so I really recommend taking a look at the paper because I think there were some pretty good thoughts that he provided in there. But just to summarize a few that I thought were fairly pertinent. What he was doing is he was comparing the old, Rainbow Series Green Book, which was a password guidance document that was published by the Department of Defense back in 1985, and sort of comparing it with how we should be thinking about today, passwords in today's environment, where, back then networking was certainly not anywhere nearly as prominent. There weren't nearly as many machines, whereas today that has certainly changed. So there are a number of points that are made in the document in terms of what things have basically persisted about good password management, but I thought I'd point out a few that have changed significantly. One of these in particular was the simplest way to recover from a compromised password is to change it. Back in the old days, the thought was that when somebody got into a machine, that they may have compromised that machine, but you can change the password, basically lock them out, and continue on about your business. Well, Bill Cheswick's point here is that's completely wrong now, and his quote here, once an account is compromised, the rot sets in. That is effectively due to trust behaviors between machines and the opportunity to escalate privileges. It provides an opportunity for an attacker to get in, seeded into the machine, and just changing a password isn't going to save you. So it's going to take some significantly greater remediation activities in order to get a compromise out of your system, or basically restore the state. Second one here is to, the conventional wisdom was don't write your passwords down. And that was a time where you might have access to one or two systems, and you might be able to remember those passwords. And in fact, perhaps the concern was that somebody, within the organization or something was your greatest concern in terms of being able to access your password or to abuse your account. Whereas I think that's significantly changed. I think Bill Cheswick agrees with that. His quote here is, it's probably much safer than using the same password on multiple machines. That is, you're probably better off writing down your passwords and keeping a reference and making sure that you have unique passwords with different accounts and different systems. Examples might be your email account and, Facebook account or something. You don't want to have the same passwords in those because a compromise in one could translate to a compromise in another. And certainly you wouldn't want, an email account password to be the same as you use for online banking, because that would obviously provide a very dangerous transient effect.
Yeah, as he pointed out in the article, in 1985 they were concerned about, the sticky note next to the keyboard or under the keyboard. Mm-hmm. And, if you've got physical access, that's something to be worried about. But now with a lot more systems that you're connecting to over the Internet, that's not so much the concern. The concern is, as you said, use the same password multiple places. Once you got it one place, then you go anywhere else with it. So it's better off trying longer, more complex ones that you need to write down because you can't remember them all.
Good point, Jim. And the next one that I thought I'd share with you here is the change your passwords often. Well, Bill's point here is it's generally a bad idea to change your passwords often, and it's not particularly useful. And the reason why is he goes into some reasonable amount of detail about this in terms of, what it would take to actually guess a password and how long that might take over time. I think the more significant factor here is, and he points this out as well, is that if you have a really good password, it may be somewhat difficult to remember, and changing frequently is going to make it even more difficult to remember. So you're probably better off having a better password and remembering that over a period of time than it is to change it frequently. Now, all of this becomes sort of a subjective nature of how frequently is the right amount, because there is sort of a point that is you want to try to at least minimize the possibility of having been compromised and not realizing that, and having at least the opportunity to lock out somebody that had some access. So there is a little bit of a balance there. I think there's still some value in changing passwords over time, but frequently is probably not the right way to do that. And again, it becomes a little bit subjective in nature in that regard. So anyway, those are some of the points that, again, I want to point you to the paper because I think he made a number of good points. And perhaps I'm not aware of any updated guidance documents that have been, published in an official sense about password management. And, perhaps since 1985, being about 18 years later now, it's probably a good time to perhaps rethink that and develop some new standards along those lines.
Yeah,
with that, I think.
Well, to follow on to that, I did a post on the Networking Exchange blog last June, 8 thoughts on password and password and some of the same ideas, and this got me thinking about some of the things that I had talked about then, or some of the things that I didn't talk about then. Things like, rather than using a simple hash, use something more complex to slow down the automated password guessing. Bill's paper there has some statistics in there that I thought were very interesting. And again, I also recommend to our viewers and listeners to go check out the paper yourself. But there was some stuff in there about the sweet spot of how long and complex is long enough, given the ability of machines to guess passwords quickly. And I had mentioned in the paper, and when I talked about it here on ThreatTraq shortly after that, in some of the other hashes specifically for doing passwords that basically take longer. I mean, the SHA-1 and the MD5 developed for a specific purpose, and one of their reasons for being was to work quickly. But when you've got somebody doing password guessing, you don't want them to go too quickly. And so, Cheswick mentioned adding a 1-second delay in there, or maybe it was in one of the comments about his post. Mm-hmm. Using some of the other standards for password hashing is also a good choice.
Right. You bring up a couple of very good points here, and I guess I'd refer folks to your blog as well, because it is a good article that you had posted there and some good thought put into it. A couple of items, to your point, so long as you're confident that your attackers are restricted to using the interface that you're providing, adding some delay certainly can slow down their opportunity to guess additional passwords, and that's one of the arguments behind, if you misguessed a password a number of times, say, 3 or 5 times, it's a good practice to lock out that account for maybe 15 minutes or so, and it certainly can significantly slow down the opportunity to continue to perform guessing attacks. And I think to your point, a more complex hashing algorithm, one that requires more processing power to do the calculations, can certainly slow down the opportunity to crack passwords if they've been able to capture those hashes. And it provides a better opportunity to protect those. But still, I guess it's somewhat of a risk if the passwords themselves aren't sufficiently complex, and that ultimately becomes the trick, is making sure that, in some of these cases where default passwords are being used, none of these practices really give you much of a chance. So.
Right, or if it's a keylogger that they use to capture it, then all bets are off too.
Mm-hmm. So with that, let me go ahead and pass the reins to you here, Jim, and I think you have a little more to tell us about passwords, right?
Yeah, well, passwords have been topic on this show 3 or 4 times in the last month or two, and I've, on a couple of occasions, mentioned it was time to go back and look at what we had captured in our honeypots. So I finally did that analysis this week. I also have gotten access to a bigger pool of captured passwords, and I have not done the complete analysis on that bigger pool, and maybe I'll take a look at that here in the next couple of weeks too. But as I've mentioned when we've looked at this, we've done this once or 2 or 3 times in the past. We've got a honeypot that we've had sitting out on the internet for quite some time, and it's not advertised any place. It doesn't show up in DNS. Doesn't have any known services that it should be used. It just sits out there and gets tripped over when people are scanning across internet space. And in July of 2011, we installed Kippo on there, which is an SSH honeypot. And what it does is it sits there, pretends to be a normal SSH server, captures username and password attempts. It has a default password, and I'll show this in a little bit. It has a default password of 123456, and if anybody guesses that one, it lets them in and pretends to be a Linux box. I think it's masquerading as some sort of a development box right now. So sometimes the bad guys will get in there, think they've got a normal Linux box, drop some of their other tools on there, and so we've used it to take a look at that from time to time. Mm-hmm. But the big thing is, it sits out there on port 22, looking like an ordinary SSH server, and there are a lot of these folks scanning for SSH to do brute force password guessing, and so we collect a lot of those username and password attempts. Also on this honeypot, we've got a fake POP3 server, and we've been actually collecting passwords on it since 2009. I didn't include those passwords in the analysis this time, although I did the last time, so I'm not exactly comparing apples to apples here. But in the analysis this time, we've got a total of 338,000 password guesses. Of those 50,000, almost 51,000 unique passwords that were guessed in that time. And the analysis here is done with a tool called People, created by DigiNinja. Those who are familiar with or into forensics and that kind of stuff probably recognize the name and the tool. It's kind of interesting. One of the things that we looked at last time, and the column on the right are the percentages from when I looked at this last June compared to now, and the most common password lengths are in the range from 3 to 12. Those are the 10 most popular ones, with the most popular length being 6. And as I note here, the longest passwords that we saw were 71 characters. That 71 character password 8 times. 50s that we've seen over 100 times. So the passwords that they're guessing are in the average 3 to 12, the normal size that people usually use in their passwords.
Jim, to the extent that you're aware, are all of these some sort of a dictionary tag that is using fixed passwords, or are there ones that are trying to walk through certain combinations?
I'm not sure I follow your question.
Have you seen any that have that appear to be walking through some sort of a sequence to try to guess every possibility of perhaps digits or something along those lines, or does it generally look like they're actually using a dictionary and choosing, prefabricated password guesses?
There are a lot of attempts to use, they'll try 1 and then 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4. And again, one of the downsides of using Kippo with the default password of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 is once they get to that one, it stops and lets them in. So I don't see necessarily all of the things that they would potentially guess. But there are a couple of different patterns that you see in this. You'll see those types where they walk through, or they'll try 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, things like that. But then you'll see some that are really bizarre, and the only thing I can figure is that they must have found these that worked someplace, and so they just added them to their dictionary. You'll get some of these that are 25 characters long. That I won't go into the details of what some of them are because it might give away where our honeypot is. But they can't. They're clearly not random. You can see some word phrases in there, but they're really strange. I can't believe that they'd be a default anyplace.
Right. Yeah, it seems that, like you pointed out, having a password of 71 characters, that just doesn't come out of the blue.
Right, exactly. And I have no idea where that one came from. I assume it must have worked someplace. Yeah, I'm not sure exactly what that was. But I put up these percentages here to show there really hasn't been a whole lot of change. And, the order has changed a little bit, but the percentages are relatively close to where they were about 10 months ago when I last did this analysis. The top 10 most popular passwords, of course, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, as I said, that's the default in Kippo. And and you see some of the other ones. The only change in the top 10 from 10 months ago till now is 111 111 dropped off and test 123 came on. Otherwise, the top 10 are all the same as they were 10 months ago. A couple of them may be in a slightly different order, but some of these percentages are rather small out of the total number of guesses that we saw. But
well, and considering the total number of guesses, this is based on the total number of guesses. So actually, you see 2.4%, for example, for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 is actually quite high relative to.
Yeah, out of the 300 and some odd thousand that we saw.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
Hey, you know, I'm sure when they're putting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 in there, they're not really looking for Kippo honeypots, but there are, you know, we had talked about these DVR botnets, or the botnet that was composed of DVR. There are a brand or a set of those DVR webcams that use that as the default password. So just as an aside, I'm sure there's other embedded appliances out there that might use that as a default password as well.
And I know there are some of the scanning tools that do look for Kippo, and you know, once they are aware that they've hit a Kippo box, they'll keep it a sure. But,
yeah, I had noticed that actually with, I was running Kippo at home for a while, and they would get in, they would immediately realize that they were in a Kippo honeypot and leave. And that forced me to change up and actually use something different. But it was a custom thing that actually gave me a lot more insight into what they were doing, because they would continue to use it. It was a real machine at that point, so to speak, a virtual machine. In any event.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, maybe I should make this look like it's a security camera DVR in the future. Maybe that would keep them looking at it a little longer.
That would be interesting. You'd have to fake out it having a MIPS processor, but that would be interesting.
The next thing I looked at was what people calls the base words in the various passwords, and here there was actually some change, although we see a lot of the same ones: password, test, root, QWERTY. But 10 months ago, Oracle, Red Hat, and Linux were all in the top 10. Those three have dropped out, and ones that have replaced them are these two CAS XSW, which on a QWERTY keyboard is going down the left-hand pinky finger column, and then, you know, down or up the next column to it. And this one down here, the cuts. I don't have any idea what that one is, but that one has been showing up all of a sudden quite a bit lately. Exactly what the deal with that one is, but I thought that was kind of interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the other analysis that People does by default, so I thought I'd put it in here. Top 10 years, you know, sequence of 4 that's in there that we think is a year. Largely the same. 2 of them dropped out. 1984 and 1985 dropped out, and 1984 and 1988 dropped out. 2000 and 1985 showed up. Again, not entirely sure what the significance of that is. The recent years kind of make sense, and the older ones may be, they think people were born, I don't know.
Perhaps graduation years.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's curious that it seems there's an underlying assumption they haven't changed their password in the last 2 years.
Yeah, well, it's an assumption that some of these passwords were set a while back and haven't been changed. That's right. And 2000 was just off this top 10 list, and 2020 was just off of there too, and that was, I don't know, I thought that was kind of interesting.
Now, do you happen to know if there are any significant number of guesses in there that would appear to be birth dates? You know, perhaps a 6-digit birth date?
That I haven't looked at in a lot of detail.
Okay.
Something I could look at.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to find out maybe sometime for the future, because, you know, obviously, birth dates are something that folks are able to remember. And, the only reason that came to mind is because they say if you want to win the entire lottery, pick something that can't be a date, because you have at least, theoretically you have an equal chance with any number of winning the lottery. But if you're guessing dates, then you're probably going to end up sharing it with others that have guessed the same thing.
No.
Piece of trivia.
The next thing that I looked at was the complexity of the passwords. Again, going back to our previous conversation there, among the interesting things, most of the passwords that were guessed, the largest portion of them, a plurality of them, were just lowercase characters. No digits, no special characters, no uppercase characters. 42% of the guesses were just lowercase characters. And these percentages are all pretty close to where they were 10 months ago. No significant change. The biggest portion is all lowercase, followed by lowercase with a digit or multiple digits, then strictly numeric, then the lowercase plus digits plus a special character, or lowercase plus a special character, then you get into the mixed case. And this all complex down here is an analysis that I did that isn't built into people, and actually I've been thinking about getting back to him and seeing if he wants to add this into his tool. But this is the number of passwords that had at least 3 of uppercase, lowercase, digit, special character,
right,
and was at least 8 characters long. This is one of the typical complexity rules that we see in a lot of places. So this was an analysis that I added to it, and there were about 4%, 3.5% of the guesses were at least 3 of those upper, lower, special case or digit, and at least 8 characters long.
It'd be interesting to see what the, if you look at the state space and consider, that's only 3.58% of the total, but the state space, because of the complexity there, would be quite a bit larger than most of the other combinations, which would suggest that, it does present a lower probability that your password is going to be guessed in the first place.
Yep. And then some of the other miscellaneous things that I noticed there, and these percentages are very close to what they were 10 months ago when I looked at it. 6% of them have a single digit on the end, 2.5% have 2 digits, and 9 3/4 have 3 digits. And the most popular final digits, this is the exact same order as it was 10 months ago and almost exact same percentages. 3 is the most popular final digit that people were guessing in this. Not sure exactly what that means, especially given the case that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 was the most popular password, so 6 is the final digit on that one. And again, the thing to point out here is this is what people are guessing against a system where they know nothing about what the potential users might be. If, in the cases where we've seen password breaches in the past where the password hashes were downloaded, then the mix of passwords is different because they're actual human beings using them, but some of the guesses might be different if you know a little bit more about the user base as well.
All right. Okay. Well, thanks, Jim. This is some good analysis, gives us some insight, and it just, you've said this a number of times, but just a reminder, this is not the distribution of passwords in use, it's the distribution of passwords that get guessed. And I think probably as pertinent as anything here is on the previous page where you showed the number of complex passwords that are being guessed actually is relatively low and certainly a very large state space. So we encourage folks to practice the use of those complex passwords. And with that, I guess what we'll do is turn to Stan here for a few minutes and talk a little bit about computer talents and becoming hackers. And I guess, Stan, you're going to help distinguish between the two here.
Well, technically, they're one and the same.
Right.
Well, this month, ACM Communications Magazine had an interesting paper that they published, which tries to explain why talented computer-savvy people become computer hackers. Even though they have, they're highly employable because of their skills, they still choose this path of what would be considered illegitimate activity.
So I guess just as a clarification here, Stan, when you refer to the term hacker here, you're referring to in a malicious sense. Is that correct?
Correct. Not like a developer who's hacking code together. No, this would be a malicious kind of actor who's after stealing information, using it maybe for criminal intent, things like that. So the way the authors of this paper conducted their research is that they interviewed 6 known hackers. And then they try to apply criminological theories to understand the phenomenon of why they become hackers. And at the end of the paper, they kind of describe this framework of theories and factors and enablers that make up a hacker. So they kind of, based on their analysis and these anecdotal stories, they broke down the evolution of a hacker into 4 steps. First, the person had an affection for computers. They liked to do things with computers. It was interesting to them. And then at some point, they started with curious exploitation of the computers for whatever reason, to cheat at video games or something like that. Something not entirely malicious, just exploratory in nature, which then led to the next step of illicit excursion, which meant, they would try something that wasn't necessarily criminal, but it was even more frowned upon. It would affect other systems, maybe gain access to systems, but not do anything malicious yet. And this finally would lead to criminal exploitation, which is using the knowledge gained from hacking for a criminal enterprise, I would say. So these 4 steps are part of 3 phases that help the skill level of the hacker evolve through their lifetime. And they break them down into initiation, when the person is first introduced to computers and how hacking works, and then the growth of the hacker, gaining more skill, understanding how computer technology works, how to get in and out of networks, and finally maturation, when kind of all the variables mix and they become technically savvy and criminally savvy, and they start down this path. So the 2 main enablers that they list that are enablers early on that cause a person to maybe start down the path to becoming a hacker is an early interest in computers, and the fact that the minds of these youths basically are not challenged. So the kids who start out this way, they have a lot of time that they spend with computers. They really enjoy it, but they're not challenged equally in subjects like in school, where they're able to apply their very technical savviness to something that wouldn't be considered hacking. And this transitions into 3 additional enablers that are actually outside sources that contribute from outside onto the person. So one thing that they noticed is that there is a lot of security vulnerabilities, and so there's lots of things to challenge these hackers, and so allow them to keep exploring and keep trying new things. The other thing they actually found is, at least for these 6 hackers they interviewed, there seemed to be a lot of tolerance. So occasionally during their youth, as they were playing around, they would get into systems, and occasionally they would get caught, but nothing happened to them. They didn't get punished. So this tolerance of them was actually an enabler that continued to allow them to explore systems and continue to try to hack. And then another enabler is the social association with others, so meeting other hackers online, on the internet, and exchanging ideas and knowledge. So there's another kind of enabler. Mm-hmm. And of course, the transition to criminal intent is the final enabler, which is the shift in moral values. So as the people grow up and they develop their moral compass, so to speak, how they make decisions and what's wrong and right, they might change their mind. So at some point, they might say that something is unacceptable. It's not acceptable to harm somebody else. But then they might, let's say, lose their job and have no money and no ways to make money. So they might choose to pursue criminal enterprise. And from the people that they interviewed, it seemed like people, when asked these kinds of questions, what would you do in a situation when, you couldn't make ends meet and things like that? Would you turn and start using these skills that you have for something more malicious? And people would say yes. So this shift in moral values is something that occurs through the lifetime, and it kind of can push the person into criminal exploitation. At the end of the paper, basically they attribute 3 theories to why or how the person emerges. So it uses all of these enablers and all of these phases and then uses criminology theory to say, what happens. So one of them is the routine action theory, which is basically, this is like a rule that says, in order for a crime to occur, the 3 things must be present in time and space: a motivated offender, an appropriate target, and the absence of able guardians. So what they say is, it's not necessarily true that these guys set out to be bad, but what happens for them, the enablers, is as they were growing up, they were the only children in their family, and they had access to a PC and internet early on, and they had lots of curiosity, and they had their own private room. So they had a lot of time to play and explore the computer as they started as children. So this would be a part of routine action theory. So certain things kind of met together to allow them to spend a lot of time with computers and explore.
Yeah, and Stan, I couldn't help but notice that was actually the routine action theory is actually also the same acronym as the remote access tools, the RAT tools.
Yes, it is.
When I first saw that in the article, I had to take a second look and see what you're actually talking about here. So, anyway.
It's interesting how that panned out, yes. So the other thing that, the other theory in criminology that they applied to this analysis was situational action theory, which basically is when a person is trying to use their moral code and experience and skill and knowledge to make decisions. So depending on the person, it can push them further into the criminal world based on this theory. And the other big enabler that they think attributes to this is the theory of social learning, and which is gained through association with others and this tolerance of their actions, and even trying to rank themselves among others, peers, and some sort of competition, which can give them additional skills and continue to push them down the path of this hacking. So at the end of the paper, they kind of talk about some solutions that they think could possibly be enacted to help direct youths more into the proper path. And they were mostly concerned, I guess, or their suggestions were at the university level. So they said by the time the people the hackers get into the university, certain enablers and their environmental conditions have already taken their effect. So you can't change things like, their computer interest or the fact that they know so much or even some of the things that they've done. But potentially, it seemed like they were suggesting you could help them with ethics and guiding their moral compass. So offering computer ethics courses was one of the solutions they offered. Creating competitions to secure networks rather than attack networks. And actually providing a zero or very low tolerance environment for feats of hacking. So don't encourage or allow things like this to go unpunished. So it's a very interesting paper. It has a lot of these interesting anecdotal stories, and I encourage everyone to check it out. We're going to provide the link with this webcast.
Yeah. Very nice rundown there, Stan. And I guess I have to reflect on a couple of things that you pointed out. I think one of you spoke in terms of enablers and the tolerance. I think I tend to think of it as the lack of a deterrent that exists. That it's one of the areas that where somebody can get sort of that thrill of doing something that they know they're not supposed to do, but at the same time, the consequences or the potential consequences have traditionally been very low. And that's why I tend to be very encouraged when I see, criminal investigations into hacking events, even if they're somewhat mundane and not particularly, high effect, high impact type of events. It still has the effect of creating a deterrent for others. And, we have to also admit the fact that the job market isn't as good as it used to be. And it's harder for folks that don't have on-the-job experience to get jobs. I have to, assume that there's at least some financial motivator for getting into, sort of turning on the dark side associated with these types of activities. But it's hard to say to what extent that's a strong influence.
That's a good point, Brian. Actually, I think they would classify that under the situational action theory, or knowledge that they're not going to get punished or that there is a big reward at the end is going to allow them to make the bad decision of becoming a hacker. Or maybe they would think it's a good decision or it's an acceptable one. Actually, to that, they bring up one example of one or two of the hackers wanted to find out, when they were in the university, wanted to find out where a girl was taking a course, which classes she was enrolled in. And instead of, they had several choices that they could possibly do, right, to find out what classes she's taking. They could have asked her directly. They could have come up to her and asked her. They could have, I guess they could have hacked into the registration system and figured it out, and they could have also followed her to see which classes she's going to. And for them, it was interesting that they chose the hacking. All right, they hacked into the registration system to find out where these girls were registered for classes. It's just, I don't know, it's interesting, but it's definitely an observation, how these guys think.
Well, that is the authoritative source of what you're registered for, isn't it?
Yes,
so with that, let's take a little bit of a look at the internet weather for the last week or so here. And by the way, thank you, Stan. That was a very good story, good find there. First of all, we'll take a look on the list here. It's Scam Probes on port 5038 TCP. This is one we've been reporting for a number of weeks now. It comes and goes in terms of the level of alertness. This is associated with asterisk voice over IP management. And in this particular case, we're seeing the majority of the probes from a single source in China. And I investigated that a little bit further. It turns out that the same source had been also seen performing probes on port 25 TCP as well as 5060 TCP over the last couple of weeks. Now, what's kind of interesting here is that, typically 5060 is associated with SIP, and usually SIP is Session Initiation Protocol, which is also associated with VoIP, is usually performed over UDP. So it's kind of curious that they were probing 5060 TCP. But the combination of those kind of suggests to me that they were, perhaps looking for opportunities for performing some sort of a spamming operation. That's purely conjecture on my part, but, through looking for SMTP ports as well as looking for VoIP access would be a potential in that direction. So nonetheless, they may have other more sinister plans in mind. It's one possibility. Next one here is Scam Probes on port 8880 TCP. This particular port is associated or basically registered to CD database protocol. I'm not particularly familiar with CD database, but it looks like it's a database application. Now, one of the things that we observed here, first of all, most of the probes are from a specific address in Germany, and there were a fewer number of probes that were associated with an address in China. It turns out that those are probably not independent activities. That is, both have been seen probing also on port 8443 TCP, and that one happens to be registered to PC Sync over HTTPS. So that's basically a file transfer synchronization protocol. Now, there's a possibility here that these ports tend to be sort of associated with as alternate ports for web as well. So there's a possibility here that what they're really probing for is web servers that may have been put on obscure ports just to sort of hide. So maybe content origination servers, for example, in a content distribution network or some other web server that you get passed over to in certain circumstances. So again, somewhat conjecture on my part, but this type of probing activity has been going on somewhat in a spiky manner. And if you're using alternate port for web servers, it is an obscuring strategy, but it certainly isn't going to protect you from being probed. Next one here, somewhat unusual, but I guess in the traditional old school sense, we talked about old password management. Here's another old protocol. This one is scan probes on port 19 UDP, and that's character generators, basically just a way to test connectivity. And this we saw from a single US-based source address. It was associated with basically a hosting provider, that source address. And we've also seen that source probing on port 22 TCP, that's SSH, as well as 53 UDP DNS. So I'm not sure what the motivation here, but clearly character generator is associated with Unix-type systems, so they may have been probing around looking for Unix-type systems that were not well protected. And that would be somewhat consistent with seeing, port 22 probing activity. The probing for port 53, perhaps looking for open DNS resolvers, again, would be typically associated with Unix systems, although certainly Windows systems can host DNS as well. And the next item here is scan probes on port 5432. This was a new one to me, but it is registered or associated with PostgreSQL database. So whereas we've seen a lot of cases in the past where most of the other popular databases, MySQL and Microsoft SQL databases, tend to get probed and password guessing attacks against those, this one is also being probed, although not particularly aggressively. This is probably an order of magnitude lower than most of the probing activities that we report on, but I thought this would be at least notable. Partly, because it is relatively new. I looked back in time and did not see a lot of probing activity on this port previously, and there is some persistence associated with this probing activity as well. So there's a possibility that may increase over time. Another significant, or at least an observation here, it was a single source that's doing this probing activity. Again, a hosting provider in the United States, different from the previous one that we just talked about. And it was also associated with scanning a couple of other ports. One is 1153 TCP. That happens to be associated with an application protocol called, it's ANSI C12.22, which is obviously not very descriptive. It happens to be associated with a utility meter. So this is one where it appears that they perhaps are looking for some type of a control system, and we would want to be paying attention to that. So certainly, and the probing activity, again, is not particularly aggressive on these other ports. The second port they were also probing was 27017 TCP, and that's a Mongo database protocol. So again, sort of reinforcing the fact that they may have been looking for databases, and I'm guessing it's password guessing attacks associated with this.
Well, and there was just last week or the week before we mentioned that there was a very significant bulletin for a vulnerability in PostgreSQL.
Okay. Well, clearly there's a possibility that they're probing for that.
Yeah, that's what comes to mind first, because that was just in the last week or two. I don't remember.
Well, and this goes back almost exactly 2 weeks here, so they are continuing that probing activity. And because it's not particularly aggressive, kind of suggests that in some respects that makes it a little bit more important. Aggressive scanning activity hopefully will show up on people's radar. When it's a little more subtle like this, it might not otherwise. Looking at the distribution of probing activity, specifically for yesterday, most of the same actors that we expect to see here: port 445, 1433, 3389, 23, 22, 5900, and port 443 in that activity. It's not fairly typical that we see port 443 showing up in the top 10 here, but at the same time, I wouldn't say that we've seen particularly aggressive activity over the last week or so, so it's not surprising that it showed up on here. Next item, basically the most sources probing. Again, no surprises in this realm either. Port 445 showing up at the top here, port 23 showing up, and actually in terms of the actual probing activity, that's basically what showed up in this chart. Although we certainly still see the zero-axis botnet peer-to-peer activity showing up in here as well, and I think John showed a timeline of that activity over the last year in last week's program, so you may be interested in that. And last, what I thought I would share with you here is, again, an update on the reconnaissance index. And basically what this is showing is the amount of probing activity as well as the number of sources of activity over a long period of time. We're basically looking back the period of a year here. And we are still continuing to see a downward trend since around the end of December when that Karna botnet that was doing the Internet Census 2012, when that botnet basically disabled itself, expired, we've since then been seeing somewhat of a decline in the amount of reconnaissance activity in total, but certainly there's an awful lot of it still out there today. And with that, I guess, you know, Stan, you look like a pretty concerned guy. So I'm kind of interested in what your concerns are recently and why you think it should be significant to us.
Well, one thing I've been recently involved in is looking at malware and examining it. And what I've come to find is that the evolution of malware obfuscation, it's still trending up. It's basically continuing to produce lots of unique malware samples based on the same obfuscated code base. So in some recent analysis, I saw a malware sample that had at least 3 levels of obfuscation before you could even figure out what it was doing. So it kind of concerns me. It's a growing trend of just adding additional levels of obfuscation. It doesn't really cause the malware authors anything, and it can be quite difficult sometimes to understand the functionality of the malware because of that.
Right. So it's I mean, first of all, it makes the generation of signatures for detection of that malware more difficult. But I guess from your perspective, certainly in analyzing that malware to identify characteristics that we would be able to identify, that certainly is something that makes your job harder. So we're going to have to reproduce you and.
Right, we're going to have to make more of me and obfuscate me a little bit to take a look at all those samples.
Yeah. And I'll go ahead and share one of my concerns here. I think John expressed one that was very similar a couple of weeks ago, and this is a little bit of an expansion of that. I think when John's concern a little while ago was the notion of sort of what I'll call some irresponsibility in some of the reporting activities. That is, in some of these denial of service attacks, for example, or in some cases, what's happening is the media is taking claims of the attackers. You know, they're posting them on Twitter, for example, and saying, "No, look, we attacked this site," and they're showing a snapshot or something along those lines. And in some cases, what's happening is some media, and it usually starts out in sort of the back lines, perhaps a blog or something like that, that will basically take something that had been posted and then basically promulgate that hacker story, which is exactly what they're trying to do, by the way, and not even really kind of raising the concern about whether even the claims are accurate or not. So, you know, in responsible reporting, you would attempt to investigate to see if you can confirm that those attacks have actually taken place. And it seems like all too often there isn't enough scrutiny about what the attackers are claiming, and it's just getting put out there. So this is an increasing concern from my point of view, because it seems like, and this is not a scientific study, it's a perception, but it seems like more groups are jumping into this notion of basically making claims about attacking activities, but near as I can tell, in many cases, they're claims that are unsubstantiated. So only time will tell, but I guess if there's any opportunity to express the desire to have a little more responsibility in the media reporting. And this, as I said, not generally the mainstream media, it's generally the blogs, but an awful lot of that gets promulgated around the internet these days. And I guess at this point, Jim, do you have any particular concerns that you'd like to share with us?
Well, just my concern this week is based on work I did to put that story together, is about passwords and places and how we do authentication. Mm-hmm. And I don't know really what the answer is, other than better. Well, and I think, as I expressed a couple of weeks ago, I think the notion of default passwords needs to simply be abolished. Absolutely, I'm with you. That's really the biggest hazard here. But and then beyond that point, we've got lots of other opportunities. But that'd be a really good starting point. Okay, so that's our show for today. If you'd like to get in touch with us, as always, you can reach us through email, the traditional way. It's threattrack@list.att.com is our email address. You can find us on Twitter. Our handle is @ThreatTraq. And this program is posted in video on the AT&T Tech channel. It's att.com/ThreatTraq. You can also search for us on YouTube, and you can subscribe to an audio-only version on iTunes as well. Thanks for joining us today. We'll be back next week with a new episode, and until then, keep your network safe.